We're going to look at the brushes category first. A rectangle is made up of three brushes: the fill, the stroke, and the opacity mask. The opacity mask allows you to cause parts of the rectangle to be visible or invisible, but right now we're going to concentrate on the fill and stroke. In the brushes category, we see a large white rectangle to indicate that the fill of our rectangle is a solid white. The stroke, a large black rectangle, shows that we have a solid black. The color editor below allows me to click on a given area of the spectrum rectangle to choose that color, and I can change the hue by dragging up or down in the hue slider. At the bottom, I'm displayed what the color of the rectangle was before I changed it, and what its current color is. The third button shows me the last color that I set, so when I choose my rectangle down here, that button maintains the olive green that I used above, so I can very quickly set that color on the new rectangle. The color picker also has a color eyedropper that you can use to pick a color up off of any element anywhere on your Windows desktop. You can click on windows outside the Blend application as well, should you need to. I also have the ability to set the red, green, and blue components manually if I happen to know what the value I'm looking for is. I click on any of the components and type in the value I'm looking for. Some people are not as comfortable with the RGB color space, so I can left-click on any of those components and a menu is displayed with several of the other more popular color spaces: HLS, HSB, and CMYK. Lastly, at the very bottom is a hex editor box in which you can type the specific hex value that the Windows Presentation Foundation is more familiar with. This box has an extra ability, however, that it understands some colors, that when I just type a color in it, it converts that to the appropriate color. This box recognizes all of the colors that the .NET framework understands, and those colors can be located in MSDN. These are all the different ways that you can set the color explicitly, but later on when we talk about resources, this tab allows you to choose any color that you've defined as a resource, and this button allows you to define the current color as a resource. We'll talk about these more when we get into resources later on. In addition to solid brushes, as you see right now, you have the ability to choose a gradient brush. When I click on that, by default I'm given a linear gradient brush spanning from black to white. Below the color picker, I now have the gradient editor bar that with a click I can add additional gradient stops, or by dragging the gradient stops downward delete them. A gradient must always have at least 2 gradient stops, so once I've deleted 2 of the stops, I can no longer delete any more. The currently selected gradient stop is shown with the black outline. When I change its color to something else, you'll see that the color is both displayed in the gradient editor below the color picker, as well as immediately live on the scene. I can drag the gradient stops around to change how the gradient looks. I can also modify the alpha value on any of my gradient stops to cause portions of the gradient to appear transparent. When I drag the rectangle over one of the other rectangles, you'll see that the green of the previous rectangle now shows through. In addition to the linear gradient, there is the radial gradient. When I choose it, I now have a gradient that spins around a central point. The gradient editor, however, still works in the same way, and I can move my gradients around and delete them however I need. I'm going to make my rectangle a little bit larger because one of the other things you can do with a gradient is use the brush transform tool. When I select that, the adorners change to display the adorners that specify the gradient. The vector here now can be modified to get different gradient styles. I can move the entire gradient if I wish. I can also skew it and translate it. Along with changing the gradient stops and the colors, there are options available on a gradient. By default, once the gradient is finished, that is, it's gone from, in this case, blue to white, it pads the remainder with the color of the gradient stop at the end. If I click on the options, I can change this to reflect, which will cause the gradient to go from blue to white, then gradually back to blue and back and forth, or I can tell the gradient to repeat, which once it's reached the end of the gradient, the white gradient stop, it immediately snaps back to the blue. Just as we had a button here that allows you to convert a color to a resource, I do have a button that allows me to convert the entire brush to a resource. Lastly, the gradient editor has a gradient eyedropper that allows you to draw a line anywhere on the artboard, and a gradient will be created for you that attempts to match that particular vector as well as it can. These vectors usually have a significantly higher number of gradient stops, but they can be used to make some really impressive gradients.